Hello, everyone. Really excited to be here today. I am Ryland Goldstein, and I'm a head of product here at Temporal. My specific focus is on like the core technology and the self-hosted and open source story that we have for the product. So my main, time spent is around all of the developer experience investments we're making, the new primitives that we're adding to the platform, the way that we can make Temporal a better platform for other people who are building platforms, and sort of all of the problems that, go along with that. And so one of the key stakeholders that I work with, in order to make all that amazing stuff happen, is Steve, who I will let introduce himself now.
Hi, my name is Steve. I am the head of engineering for the UI as well as for our kind of growing set of developer tools. It's nice to see y'all.
We'll be touching on one of those developer tools today. So
more than one.
To start off, the kind of general plan for this session is that we're going to cover the big substantive items that were in the 120 server release, and then some other things that have come in that same period of time on the UI and developer tool side. So this is all stuff that, you can play with at some level right now. It's not like stuff that's coming. This is all stuff that, you can use and, have fun with today. So that's just kind of like a forward and to keep that in mind. So the first thing that I want to talk about in that thread is the workflow update feature. And I want to call it out, like before I even get into more details, that this is an alpha feature. So, please do not go and use this for production workloads. This is not meant to be something that you're running for mission critical stuff right now. It's mostly just for us to get feedback so we can deliver it in like a very high quality fashion when it does go GA and is production ready. So with that aside, workflow update is incredibly exciting. Probably one of the most exciting features we've added to Temporal, like maybe even historically. The problem statement is that, workflows are a really useful primitive for handling like event-driven applications and for, doing like bi-directional communication with other services. And historically, there's really two primitives that you can use to make that happen. The first one is Signal, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, but a Signal is a way to send a message or an event to a workflow, and then within your workflow code, you can process those events dynamically and handle them as you will. Conversely, we have another primitive, which is called, workflow query, which actually allows you to read data from a workflow, a running workflow execution in a read-only fashion, so you can't make any changes. And so, when you use these two primitives together in conjunction, you can effectively create sort of a request response style experience. The limitation being that, there's no way to basically say, after I do, send the signal and I make this change in the workflow, please, give me the resulting value, like a conditional get set in like a transactional database or something like that. And so, the kind of reality is that if you want this sort of bi-directional request response style behavior, you end up sending a signal and then writing a bunch of workflow logic that processes a query that then pulls from the external world from your client to get the result or the updated value that was changed by that first signal being sent in. And so aside from this just not being a great experience, it's a lot of extra work. I know when I've had to deal with encode around it, it's just more work than I would have liked. But there's also real concrete limitations that affect, potential use cases and, things that people might want to do with Temporal. And specifically what I mean by that is that when you have these two separate calls, it adds quite a bit of extra latency. There's, extra round trips that need to be made to the Temporal cluster and the Temporal server. And so because of that, doing a signal and then a query actually creates compound latency that just simply won't need to exist if you're doing it in a single sort of operation, in an update. And so workflow update is the primitive that is, addressing this problem and massively improving this pattern where you need to send data and then immediately get the result of the mutation that data created on your workflow execution. And so workflow update, it's basically a superset sort of workflow signals and workflow queries. And it allows you to send a, event or a message to a workflow and then block synchronously on the result of whatever that message did to the workflow state. And so in this way, you will not need to use a signal and a query separately if all you're trying to do is a request response style, behavior. And instead, you'll just be able to rely on workflow update, which should, clean up your code quite a bit. And it will also just, improve the latency characteristics of your application by a significant amount. And I think that, to give some context, there's definitely a lot of use cases in Temporal that we see around payment processing and people doing financial transactions. often even on the edge where they're like actually at, the point of sale and they're, swiping a card, and the latency budget is very, very low in those situations. And so, this is a feature that can totally unblock, customer or user that might be trying to build something with Temporal to solve that problem, but hasn't been able to do it historically because of the latency. Now, the one thing I do also want to put on as a caveat is that the way that we've kind of sequenced the rollout of this feature is that we're starting with like a subset of the overall functionality that we want. And so the initial, version, it only works if you're sending an update from an external client that isn't like within a workflow or a Temporal application to another workflow execution. And so if you're trying to say from one workflow, do an update to another workflow, that is something that we will support in the future, but right now it's not something that we support with this alpha release. And so the only thing that you'll be able, to do with the update initially is use the gRPC client to trigger an update on a workflow execution that you've previously started. Now, in the future, we will add APIs like update with start, which is similar to signal with start, and it should allow you to, run an update even if the workflow execution isn't already running. But that's just not something that we have today. So, Steve, anything to add before I move on to the next one?
No, that's great.
Cool. All right, next one. So this is the archival redesign or overhaul, depends on how you want to call it. I don't want to just, like from the point of view of a user, it may seem just like, some iterative improvements, but it did require like a substantial rewrite of the code base. And so I want to make sure that engineering team and the engineers who were working on that get, good credit. And so I think, the problem, to give some context, is that within Temporal, you have all of these stateful entities, which are workflows that often represent really important, like, current or legacy state of your business and your business processes. And so sometimes for very direct and concrete reasons, like you just need to rely on the state in one of your workflow executions for something that's happening later in your business, or maybe for like compliance reasons where, the data has to be retained for, say, some period of time that's very long. Users often have a requirement when they come and move to Temporal that there's some period of time that after their workflow execution's complete, they still are able to access the data that they generated and that was kind of part of that execution. And so there's two real mechanisms that we've offered historically, to address this problem. The first is the retention period, which is a setting that you can configure on your Temporal server, your Temporal cluster on a namespace level, that essentially dictates how long after a workflow closes in a given namespace, Temporal server should, keep it in the database, in the actual persistence, and make it accessible. And so that way, if you do end up needing it again, or you want to reset it, or, whatever it is, you can still query workflows that are closed. So, you could want to query the data and get something out of it, that would still be possible. Now, until very recently, and I'll get into this more, the limit of how many days you could have something retained was 30. And this was for sort of like arbitrary and strange archaic reasons, but it was a reality. And so, if you wanted a, period of retention longer than 30 days, that wasn't possible. Which then is a great segue into the archival functionality, which was built to solve this exact problem and this limit with retention. And the idea was that, after, this 30-day period, the usage needs of those workflow executions changes, where it's less about like actually using them as live business processes and running resources and like, interacting with them in that way. And it almost always becomes more compliance oriented and compliance focused. Or auditing related. And so because of that, we realized the requirements very early on for archival were very different from what, people traditionally wanted with retention. And so archival was built as a feature to basically ship all of those workflow records that were previously being retained to cold storage like S3 or, Google Cloud Storage, or even like, using a Kafka connector. And instead of having them continue to be retained, often when the end of the retention period was up, people would just move them into archival. And so this is a very, very important feature. I know a lot of like enterprise companies that work with us, they have to respond to a lot of like PII and, kind of compliance and auditing requests. And so it's very important that they have this sort of paper trail, so to speak. And so, archival is a great solution for that. The problem is that historically, we implemented archival in a way where there was a lot of kind of like gaps and issues with it. Gaps around, the efficiency of it and like, how well it would work when the system was under load, and like how well the resources were isolated in terms of like, this is being done on a per namespace level, but like, is that leaking to other namespaces in terms of the performance implications? And most importantly, there was a edge case where if you had a very large workflow history and, it was trying to be archived and sent to S3, and say that, either the network or S3 itself was down and like a number of minutes went by, like I think it was 10 or 15, eventually the logic would actually just effectively stop trying to send that workflow execution to Archival, and it would eventually just go away and you would lose that data. And so that was like a really, really bad situation that you could get into very rarely, but with Archival feature. And so this overhaul for Archival, it actually completely and totally like addresses all of those challenges. So it improves the performance just in the general case, like just out of the gate. It makes it much better when the system is under load, provides much stronger durability guarantees. It will now infinitely retry depending, or no matter what size of workflow history that you have. So you don't ever have to worry about data loss. And then the very, very interesting thing is that because of like, we could say spaghetti or something like that, the logic for retention and the limit of the 30 days that you were allowed was actually inherently tied to the way the Archival was built. And so this actually also opened it up for us to be able to allow users to have Archival or retention periods that are longer than 30 days. So starting with 120, you can set a retention period that is longer than 30 days for the first time. And so that's sort of a high level overview. From the feature and functionality point of view, Archival isn't going to look very different. I think that's a positive because the overall experience wasn't terrible from like how you use it. But you will feel a lot better now knowing that it will eventually, put all of those things in cold storage and you never have to worry about data loss. And also you can have a much larger retention period too. Any comments, Steve, before I move on?
No, I love it. One question for you.
Yeah.
Just for everyone's kind of a question that maybe other people are asking. So I know the old Archival feature was one of those interesting ones where it was always, I think, effectively an experimental feature. What is the current like status of the new Archival feature? Would you say that it's still like a kind of preview, or how would you view it?
That's a great question. I think that right now we feel pretty confident in it. I haven't heard any messaging that we're like rolling this out in like a beta or an alpha capacity. So I think that right now our messaging is that you should feel very comfortable using this for prime time. I think it's easier when the last version of it had a known very problematic issue where it's like, the bar isn't super high for it being an improvement. And so I think there's no point in putting it as alpha and beta because we know that this is measurably better than what we had before. All right, next one, very exciting. So this one is this new feature that we added. We've actually had it in like a beta alpha capacity until 120, but now it's officially like GA and production ready. And it's called scheduled actions, or more specifically for what we support right now, scheduled workflows. And so the problem statement is pretty straightforward on this one. Cron jobs are really, really popular. And like, in fact, when I kind of, I've talked to a lot of Temporal users, probably, like thousands of people who use Temporal. And surprisingly, like there's almost two buckets that adopters fall into, like the motivation for why they adopted Temporal. It's either for like some sort of cross-service communication, and there's a lot of flavors of that, like, even in infrastructure provisioning and stuff, I would kind of consider falling in that bucket. So there's like service communication, and then there's cron. Basically, those are the two major reasons that people initially adopt Temporal, at least from my experience. And so, that's to say that as much as we don't really focus on it in our messaging and stuff, Temporal, being used for cron is incredibly popular reason why people adopt our product, especially initially. And so I think it's pretty clear why. If you look in the ecosystem, there's really not a good solution for running cron jobs in a like scalable and durable way. I know that when I was working, as an engineer, that was something that I had to solve for, and it was very treacherous and almost always ended up requiring me to run some sort of hand-rolled thing. And so this is, something that we very clearly were solving that most, solutions were not. And so we've historically had this, feature and functionality that we called Temporal Cron. And this was very popular and it was very powerful, but there was a lot of like issues with it, just, being honest. There was a lot of things that it didn't do that you would really have loved it to do. So for example, you couldn't pause Temporal Cron before, and you also couldn't stop it without affecting like the workflows that it triggers as part of the schedule it's firing. You also couldn't terminate the workflow without terminating the cron job itself, which is very backwards because those things should be very independent. You couldn't update it, you couldn't edit it. There was no support for like the concept of overlapping runs. So say there's one run that got kicked off, like a workflow that's running, and then the cron is supposed to fire again, but that first workflow it started is still running. Like, how do you handle that? There was no way to control that before. Also, when you started temporal cron, like a new cron job, you couldn't query it. So it was basically just there was no way to get visibility into it. And in general, there was no good visibility story for running temporal cron jobs before. And so, about a year ago, we realized, okay, this is a very, very popular reason, people are adopting temporal, and this is a very popular piece of functionality, but we're just really unhappy with, the place it's at and the way that it works and the overall user experience around it. And so at first we kind of thought about it from the point of view of, iterative improvements and like, can we do this in place? But after we spent some time with it, it became very clear that like that was just not going to cut it. And so that's when we decided that we were going to basically, do an overhaul or revisit the functionality entirely. And so scheduled workflows is like a year of hard work, very hard work from a few engineers, and especially one, David, who is, I don't know if he's on here, but, he put a lot of time and energy and heart into this new scheduled workflows. And so scheduled workflows, it doesn't totally and completely replace temporal cron. There's some like very high throughput use cases where you still might want to consider temporal cron, but I would say for like 99% of users, they should just reach for scheduled workflows. It's more intuitive to use. The entire user and developer experience around it has a lot of thought has been put into it. And so, the API is much more intuitive. It's much more straightforward. It's also way more powerful. There's way more functionality. You can pause and unpause. And I'm actually going to show a demo of all this stuff in a few minutes. So I won't get too much into it until then. But generally speaking, we've added a lot of features that weren't there that people had always wanted historically. We made, custom UI. We added an entirely new way of accessing it from the CLI. And so there's just a well thought out experience around this entire set of functionality that didn't exist before. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now because I'm going to get into that more with the demo, but very exciting.
Ryland, I have a question for you.
Yep.
Like, what are, with the new schedules, and I'm putting you on the spot here, so feel free to deflect. What are some of the kind of, what are some things that, people who are used temporal in the past, like what are some of the things that like this new schedule feature might unlock that they maybe you haven't thought of, right? They go, cool. I would love to like schedule a workflow. What are some like of the exemplar use cases that you've kind of seen as you've talked to customers and kind of gotten requests and stuff along those lines?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, so this is one where you wouldn't want to just leverage, scheduled workflows alone, but you would want to use it in conjunction with something like one of, our batch APIs. But there's a very large customer we have that's actually running on our cloud that is like a very well-known financial company. Like I promise almost everyone who's listening knows of them. And effectively, every month they need to generate a lot of invoices and send those, on a very specific timeline. Like it's not something where you can afford to not have them delivered or even have them delivered too late. And so they need to do this, and really they only need to do it once a month. And they need to make sure it's super reliable. And so basically what they do is they use temporal and they have, a bunch of scheduled workflows that run. And when those scheduled workflows, run and they fire, those workflows that they fire actually then use the batch APIs to create a bunch of individual batch jobs using child workflows to process all of the individual invoices, because there's enough business logic on each invoice that it makes sense to have them run in individual workflows. And so that's a good example where like, the schedule workflows feature is being used in conjunction with our batch API to do like a large scale sort of almost, MapReduce style job. Now, again, temporal is not like a big data platform. So like the way that you approach that problem and sort of some of the specific choices you need to make in the way that you propagate all the data out, you need to be, kind of thoughtful about it. But it is a very viable use case to do stuff like that with, the scheduled workflows feature.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So next one, advanced visibility on standard persistence. So yeah, just to give a bit of background, we have a visibility API as part of the temporal server. The visibility API gives you sort of a set of indices on running workflow executions. I think that's the best way to put it, where you can have custom indexes with your own metadata, or even by default, there's, a set of indices, and you might not even realize that they're, part of this visibility API. Like I believe, the run ID and even some of the basic workflow properties that you see in the UI are actually just, from visibility itself. And so there's these set of indices that are maintained. If you're not using Elasticsearch, the default ones are maintained within your database or your persistence. So if you're using MySQL or Cassandra or whatever it is. And so by default, you have access to these things, and you always have access to the very, kind of basic properties. But one of the things that, we've supported from pretty much the beginning of this technology is this ability to have your own set of indices that you have associated with workflow executions at a namespace level. And so you can say, I want to have my own index called business ID that's on every single workflow execution. And within a workflow execution, I can basically upsert, that specific business ID. So when I go and look at that workflow execution in the UI, I can see, what that business ID is for it, or the business status, or basically anything else that you can think up or imagine. And the use cases for this, this is the advanced visibility portion, the portion where you can actually set your own and use your own custom searchable attributes is what we call them. That's the advanced part. The basic visibility is the part that, you can't create your own properties, just the basic ones that are built in that you might not even realize are part of this. And so, the advanced visibility is really, really powerful sort of, set of features that allow you to really have an easy time operating your temporal cluster and managing a lot of running workflow executions, because you can do something like ask, what are all the workflow executions that are in the business state blocked, and then have an operator go through and manually remediate those workflow executions. And so this is a very, very powerful set of APIs and tools that we have. Now, initially, back in like the Cadence days, this was something that we just supported by default on all the persistence. You didn't need Elasticsearch. You didn't need to bring in any dependencies. But there was enough scenarios and situations that happened where people ran really large queries that on a lot of running workflow executions when it was being done with the traditional like Cassandra database that actually brought down the entire temporal cluster. And so there was a really important choice made, early on to switch and not just support, advanced visibility on top of Cassandra, but also to support an external dependency, which is Elasticsearch, that is really dedicated to solving this type of problem. And that would become like sort of the blessed way of, doing this advanced visibility and supporting that at scale. And so historically, until very recently, this has been the real only way to run, advanced visibility with temporal in a production environment. Now, for legacy reasons, Cassandra always had this support for, advanced visibility, because that was the initial thing that supported it in the first place. But we've even cautioned users for quite a while now that you should not be relying on, Cassandra for your advanced visibility in a production scale environment. So that's where things have been. Now, what kind of is happening is that, we have this thing that's called the Temporal CLI, which I'll get into next, which really kind of like pushed the boundaries of how we're thinking about people, using temporal and getting started with temporal. And one of the requirements was that, we want to be able to run the full temporal sort of experience without needing to bring in all these external dependencies like Elasticsearch. And so we realized the way that we would need to make that happen is by, actually adding support for, advanced visibility on top of the standard persistences, specifically the SQL-based persistences. And so that's sort of what we've undertaken in the last 6 months. And now what that means for users is that it is actually possible to run like the full temporal API experience without bringing in Elasticsearch as a dependency and without using Cassandra. And in fact, as part of this, we've actually deprecated support for advanced visibility on top of Cassandra. And the reason why we're doing that is that generally speaking, you shouldn't really be using Cassandra to do local development. Like it just doesn't really make a ton of sense. And so there's no real good reason, in a production environment to run advanced visibility on Cassandra, and like shouldn't really be using it for local development. So like doesn't really make sense to support it there. Now, on the other hand, and we'll get into this more in a quick sec, there are good reasons that you might want to run, in a local or small scale, advanced visibility on top of a SQL database like MySQL or Postgres or even SQLite. And so this is what we've added support for, the ability to sort of run these things on top of these, SQL-based persistences. Now, again, this is not meant to be like a scalable performance solution. Please don't go and run this in production and like bring down your cluster with a big visibility query. But if you're running at a very small scale, but specifically local development environment, you should be totally okay to use this. And then you don't have to worry about bringing in extra dependencies just to get the full value of temporal. So I'm actually not going to talk too much more about that independently, because I think it's just more worthwhile to get into the sort of the big thing here, which is the Temporal CLI. So the story for this is that from the like pretty much the beginning of me joining Temporal. I think one of the first things that like our CEO Max told me was that we need a single binary for Temporal. What he meant by that is like a single executable file that includes all of the stuff that, like represents Temporal without requiring some sort of Docker or, container-based solution. And so, for some of you, it may not seem like all that intuitive or all that like, it might not make sense, but a lot of people actually aren't that familiar with Docker. A lot of people aren't that, kind of like experienced using Docker, and maybe they just don't like the, containerized environments. And so because of that, Docker being the way that you get started with Temporal and develop with Temporal has actually been like kind of a problem historically. It's sort of a barrier of entry for people, and they don't like it. It's just extra overhead. It does make things extra work in certain situations, and so this has actually been sort of a point of friction for us that we've seen grown and grown over time. And so from the beginning, we kind of identified that this is something that we wanted to solve for, but it was one of those things where I'm sure many people can relate to. We didn't prioritize it well enough, and we really should have. It was really high impact and valuable, but we just didn't get around to it. Now, fortunately, one of the huge benefits of open source is that people can artificially solve our inadequacies and the things that, we're not doing quite as well. And so the lovely folks over at Datadog, and specifically, Jacob, who is the person who brought Temporal into Datadog, he also independently identified that there would be a huge value in, providing this sort of single binary experience. And so about a year ago, he approached me and said, hey, look, I'm thinking about contributing single binary, basically this thing that he was calling Temporal Lite, to Temporal, at least putting it out there as a repo. Like, do you guys have any issues, or is that something that you guys have thought about? And immediately we were really, really excited. And part of the reason why we hadn't built it, which was part of the reason we got even more excited, is that you can't just take all of the Temporal server code and compile it alongside the dependencies into a single binary. Like, the code is easy, but when you start talking about MySQL or, previously Elasticsearch, there's no real straightforward way of just compiling that in line in another language's binary. And so we needed a way to get all of those, dependencies into the same compiled binary that the Temporal server code was going to be in. And so one dimension of that problem was the visibility side, which we just talked about with, advanced visibility on top of standard persistence, which I'll explain in a sec why that actually is, kind of unlocked by the other thing, which is what Datadog mainly contributed, which is a driver for SQLite, which is an in-memory MySQL compatible database to Temporal. And so immediately what that meant is because SQLite is in memory, and it can be basically included as just a library, we were then able to compile that as part of the server code into a single binary experience. And the database is in memory, which makes it all work really, really smoothly. And so this is what Datadog was calling Temporal Lite, which is, Temporal server compiled with a SQLite dependency in line. And so you could use Temporal, almost all of Temporal, just without Docker or any of that stuff in a self-contained single binary. Now, the one kind of missing piece of that, and while that was amazing, immediately most of the people internally in the company, even when it was just, Temporal Lite without support for advanced visibility, people started freaking out and using it immediately. Now, the thing is that we were so excited about it, we knew that we needed to make it the default experience for people to get started with Temporal. And so we approached Datadog and, asked, hey, we really love what you did here. We're so appreciative. You guys did all this work that we weren't able to or weren't willing to, but we think that it would just be best for the health of, the project and the community if it lives under the Temporal organization. And so Datadog was super friendly. They're a great partner, and they were happy to do that. And so what that then kind of enabled us to do is prioritize formally the investment in, what I was just talking about before, this advanced visibility on top of standard persistence, which just landed in the 120 release. And what that means is that now, for the first time, it's possible to run a fully self-contained Temporal cluster with full advanced visibility and, working persistence without needing to bring in any external dependencies that don't just live in that binary that you download. And so I'll actually kind of demo this as part of the demo for schedules. But the idea is that, you can get this from your friendly package manager. I know at least it's on Brew already. There's a curl command that you can get from the repo. And I also put out a blog post that I worked on with Jacob from Datadog just today, talking about this whole process and kind of what led into it. So if you're more interested in sort of the background and how we got here, there's a good post covering that. Steve, any comments before I get into the demo? I actually can't hear you, Steve. Is that just me?
No, I muted because I was like agreeing with you while you were talking, and I thought that might be distracting. So then I muted, and then you asked me a question, and I forgot that I had done that. So, behind the scenes going on there. No, I think I just kind of encourage people, like, it is one of those things where the lightweight aspect of it and the fact that it is easy kind of to embed as well is I think super powerful. And it is one of those things where you first kick the tires on it and you are like, this is super cool, but then you kind of get more ideas of how you can use it as you go along, which is certainly true for us. We use it like by default when we spin up our local development environment for working on the UI as well. And kind of just, also highlight what you're saying about the kind of unified persistence. I think there was a lot of stuff that, we did in the UI, and I think probably is representative of what other people had to do with, like, certain queries previously weren't supported. So you had to do this like dance where you were putting together queries and we had to play the lowest common denominator because we had to support everything around, like, now the queries that you use in development are also queries that you can and should probably use in production, which I think just the removal of that friction seems like a really small thing, but as somebody who's been using it for the last like 3 months, I think will be one of those things that pays off in dividends over time.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it is much lighter weight, and it just feels so much better to work with, as we'll see in a sec. And I think one thing you made me remember as well is that another key part of what we did with this tool is that, as we were kind of looking at, taking advanced visibility and making that embedded and possible within the Temporal CLI as part of Temporal Lite, one of the things I also thought about was, okay, why do we even have more than one tool? If we're going to just have a single binary experience for, the server, why do we need this separate TCTL thing? And so we had actually already in the last year and a half redesigned TCTL, and we just hadn't released it yet because we're sort of still iterating on it. And so we made this decision, why not just combine that next generation TCTL experience with this new Temporal CLI, which has, the self-contained local development environment. And that way you only ever need one tool for using Temporal. And so that's also kind of been included in what I'm about to show you. Mm-hmm. But just to make it clear.
If I may interrupt you for a moment, I think the other really powerful thing in development that was a choice, which is when you terminate, that's an overloaded word, but when you kill the process running the single binary temporal experience and you start it back up again, you get a clean slate, right? Versus in Docker, where you might have like old things in your databases and stuff along those lines. So, personally, when I'm developing and experimenting and trying stuff out, the idea that I can start fresh just by spinning the server back up and get a completely tabula rasa clean slate has for me been a really powerful, just on a developer ergonomics level.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you leave your server running, you might remember with Docker, if you leave on a MacBook, at least overnight or for a few days, you might just come back and the server isn't working anymore. Specifically in Docker, I don't know why, it's like a local development thing. And so that doesn't happen anymore. The server is always running and working. There's no sort of staleness that happens over time. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of give a very quick demo of both the Temporal CLI. Some of you may have noticed I was just quickly showing, I had an update even that you can just get this from Brew. It's just under Temporal, so pretty straightforward. And this is the command that you will use to start your local development server. And as you can see, it's already up. That's it. That's all it takes. It's very, very fast, much faster than what you previously had with Docker. So now what I'm going to get into just briefly is a demo of our scheduled workflows feature, which I was talking about before. I'm going to be showing this demo in the TypeScript SDK just because, honestly, I needed to choose one. We actually have really good samples for it. I'm using a sample from the TypeScript samples repo, so you can just go to GitHub and check that out if you're interested in what I'm doing here. Now, there's three major configuration objects that you want to know about when you're starting a scheduled workflow. The first one is the action object. Now, right now, there's only one type of action, so this is pretty straightforward. It's start workflow. The kind of idea being that in the future, we might want to support having the ability to send a signal on a schedule. And that's why we call it scheduled actions at a high level and not scheduled workflows, because in the future, we want to be able to schedule things that aren't necessarily workflows. But that's getting ahead of ourselves because today you only have workflows. So we're going to keep that as start workflow. And then there's three parameters that are required. The first one is workflow type. So this is the actual workflow that will be triggered whenever this schedule fires. So I have this open in another file here. As you can see, very straightforward. Reminder workflow takes in a single argument, it's a text string, and then it just propagates this to 2 activities that are adding a reminder to a database and notifying a user. Then we have args. This is not required, but this is, the argument that you might want passed to this reminder workflow. So just to make that super concrete, in this case, this would pass this dear future self, please take out the recycling tonight, to this reminder, and it would be populated in that text variable. And then last but not least, we have task queue. This is, just not anything specific to schedules. This is just a requirement when you're starting a workflow in Temporal. So not really anything special or unique to talk about there. Next, we have our spec. This is probably the most important part of configuring your schedule workflow. This is actually how you determine how often this thing will fire and how often your schedule will actually run. And so there's 2 major formats that we support for the spec. The first one is the one that is sort of uncommented right now. It's called the interval format. It's sort of very human readable and straightforward and easy on the eyes. And then we have a second format, which is much more expressive and robust, which is the calendar format. And you can see some of the things that you can kind of specify with that format here. And very importantly, this is the format which will support a traditional cron style string. If you're using another cron solution, it should be easy to migrate by just using the calendar format. So that's the spec. There's a bunch more options and ways you can configure things, but those are available on our docs. They do a great job, so I won't enumerate them right now. And then lastly, we have the policies object, and there's 2 major things within policies. The first one is the catch-up window. And so to understand what the catch-up window is kind of representing, imagine the situation where you have a schedule running in your temporal cluster. For some reason, the cluster goes down, and that schedule was supposed to fire, and then the cluster comes back up, and the cluster needs to determine, should I fire that workflow that should have fired but didn't because I was down? And so the default behavior for this is that the catch-up window is 1 hour or 1 minute, I think. Actually, it's 1 minute. And what that means is that if there was a scheduled workflow that was supposed to fire in the last minute, even if the cluster was down, when it comes back up, still fire that workflow. Otherwise, basically just act like, it never happened or it shouldn't have happened. And so this is just saying that we want that to be a day, which would then give us a day of sort of window. And if our cluster goes down, to keep running those jobs that were missed. And then the other thing is the overlap policy. Both of these things were not possible to do in the temporal cron solution, which was the original existing solution. And so what the overlap policy allows you to do is define the case and the behavior in the case where you have a schedule that's running and it starts a workflow, and that workflow, for either reasons that are intentional because of the logic and it just takes a long time, or a bug, is still running when that schedule is supposed to fire again. And so by default, I believe the policy is skip, which means that if the workflow execution is running from the previous time of being fired and another one is supposed to happen, it will simply just not happen and it will be skipped. But there's a bunch of other options you can provide here, like allow all. This is the only option that allows you to have multiple workflow executions running for a single schedule. There's buffer all, which would then create a buffer of all of them, but they would still run one at a time, buffer one, and so on and so forth. And again, those are well described and documented on our website, so no need to get into all the specifics. So those are all the moving pieces that are required for actually creating a schedule. So in this code here, I'm just creating that schedule. The only thing that isn't familiar already is the schedule ID. This is kind of analogous to like a workflow ID. Every schedule needs to have a unique business level identifier. So that's something that, you'll need to kind of name correctly, but not much more to say there. Cool. So now I'm just going to kind of quickly show how this works. Again, this is in our TypeScript samples repo. So all of this is available. All these commands I'm about to run are available. So if you can't follow me while I'm doing it there, it's no need to be worried. So this first script, what it does is it just actually runs this file that's on the left. So it's just creating that schedule. And now what I'm going to do is go into the Temporal UI very briefly. Yes, check out the new top navigation, please. And I'm going to go to schedules and refresh. And as we can see, there's now this schedule running. We have a dedicated UI for it, which is really beautiful. A lot of hard work went into that. So please appreciate it like I do. And from this screen, you can see, some of the upcoming runs for this schedule. You can see the recent runs. You can see what the frequency is, and, a bunch of other things. And so what we're going to do, we're going to go here and we're going to look how this is going. And as we can see, there's an issue, which is that there's no actual workers running. And so we're going to go back to our terminal. We're just going to very quickly run yarn start, which starts our worker. And the expectation will be is that we should see that string print out here that we put in. And indeed we do. Dear future self, please take out the recycling tonight. And we see it firing again. So now if we refresh, we should see that this workflow has successfully completed. And so now if we go back to our schedules, what I would love to show next, now we can see that there's been these 2 completed runs, is to just demonstrate some of the other things that you can control about scheduled workflows from the UI. So the first one, very straightforward, you can pause. So you can pause this workflow. That's not been possible with the temporal cron solution. In fact, it's not even possible with workflows in general. And so it's now possible to pause these things and obviously to unpause them. Now, the other very interesting thing is that you can also edit a schedule. So there's this amazing part of the UI where you can go and change things other than the name itself. You can change the workflow type. I won't do that because that requires me to go and change code. You can change the workflow ID. You can change the task queue. You can even change the interval. So we could just say we want it to be, 5 seconds instead of 10 seconds, which it just previously was. And now if we go here, we should see that it's running every 5 seconds now. And so we've made the UI a lot more powerful in terms of actually mutating and working with these resources than it was before. And then the last thing, just to briefly show, and I won't actually get into it, because we've included the CLI TCTL into this temporal single binary and the temporal CLI, you can also now do all of the work that you would do, traditionally with the TCTL through this temporal tool. And so here's a nice section of the CLI that we built just for, managing your scheduled workflows. And so you can do things like if you wanted to, what's a good example? You can trigger an action immediately. You can, do something like pause it. You can list your schedules if you want to know what are all the schedules that are, available or currently running. You can update them. And so basically anything that you can do from the UI and more, you can do from this temporal tool now. So I think that's all I wanted to cover here. Anything I missed, Steve?
No, I think you got everything.
Very cool. Well, turn it over to you.
All right. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about just, kind of some of the updates to the UI. And I should note that unlike or in addition to our kind of normal release cycle, updates to the UI don't necessarily, they can kind of come in between 120 and 121, or in this case, 119 and 120. So some of these you might have seen kind of in the past as we've kind of updated some things. And it is one of those things where we're always trying to iterate and add additional features kind of based on user feedback. So we deeply love it, especially because, for us internally too, which is when you see a UI every day, you tend to get very used to it. And so I think a lot of the either beginner's mind in a lot of cases, or just outside perspectives and, different use cases than maybe we tend to use in our day-to-day is always incredibly helpful to us. So the major thing that I kind of want to talk about is previously, prior to last month or two, or really 3 months, there were things like canceling and signaling a workflow that you could only do from a command line tool. And it would be great if you could also do that from the UI. So we'll talk about some of those things as well. And as I do that, I will just kind of mention some of the kind of quality of life things that have improved along the way. So one thing I kind of want to draw your attention to is, on top of the kind of main workflows page that we drop you into in the kind of open source experience, you do have the ability to access the schedules, kind of see information about namespaces, as well as see the archive, as well as kind of like Ryland mentioned. So everything that Ryland mentioned for 120 is, for the most part, also present in the UI. And, you can either see that in the large view or the small view. And we, as you saw Ryland in the demo, we've got some, great experiences around kind of wrapping your head around how some of these new features work through using the UI. So in this case, you'll see previously in what we used to call Web v1, rest in peace, you only had the ability to terminate a workflow. Now you'll kind of see over in the upper right the ability not, also request cancellation of a workflow. And there's kind of an extension on that menu as well, where you can still terminate the workflow. You can also reset a workflow. You can send a signal to the workflow from the UI, as well as as you just saw, request the cancellation from a workflow. So that's kind of, for the most part, parity with a lot of things you can do from TCTL. You can now also do from the UI. With that, you will get the ability, if you just want to click stuff or you accidentally click something, you will have the ability to kind of like confirm that that's a thing that you want to do. So you can safely press that button if you want to, and then back away if that's not necessarily your intention at the time, as well as kind of some, guidance into ways that you can reset the workflow. And like I said, we are constantly kind of iterating and taking some of the feedback. The initial foray into this was to kind of just do a very kind of simple implementation and then kind of put it out into the wild and get as much feedback as possible as we sought to iterate, rather than in our little like quiet area come up with what, quote unquote, the perfect solution and hope that that was right. As well as sending a signal, you can at this moment, kind of in our initial research, like most of the time that took the form of JSON. So, part of like sending a signal was, of course, the what is the payload of the signal. Like I said, if other formats are interesting to you, definitely reach out to us. I think, part of, the issue is like, as our general stance, we don't collect a lot of any data really, on the usage of temporal. So some of this involves, either just kind of talking to you all and engaging with the community to find out what those things are. So if there are use cases that you have, like, definitely don't consider this to be the be all and end all of where we seek to take these features, but the kind of initial forays so we can kind of gather feedback and iterate as they do. And as usual, you have the ability to terminate the workflow. And so these are things you can do to an individual workflow. We also added the ability to do that, a kind of across workflows. So you can select any number of workflows or all of them. I will kind of point out that in terms of terminating, canceling a workflow, that you can only do that to running workflows. So even if you were to go ahead, you can kind of see this in the next screenshot. If I select all, we will only apply that to the running workflow. So you have both the ability to kind of select everything that we do have loaded into the UI, but not necessarily worry about like what happens if I pick the wrong thing. Like, we will kind of handle that for you on your behalf. And this is kind of using the same sets of APIs that I think we shipped slightly earlier. I don't remember exactly what release. I want to say 118 on the command line piece also. As we kind of merge everything you can do from the command line, we seek that you should be able to do it from the UI as well. You can, like I said, you can request cancellation, you can terminate, you can provide a reason for your audit logging purposes, so on and so forth. If you do log into a relatively new version of the UI, you'll also see that there is a new top navigation as well. And before I go into that, just in a certain like slide order snafu, I do want to point out that in terms of like, let's say you don't want the ability to reset a workflow enabled, you can, in terms of like how you choose to set the environment variables, how you configure temporal, particularly this is in this case from the Docker repo, you can basically choose which bits you choose to flip on and off as well. But like I said, back to that top navigation, we moved some things around to kind of just make better use of screen real estate, and some things that were maybe always present and available in the UI, but maybe not immediately discoverable. We would obviously, love it if that was easy to discover. So we've got this ability to both switch namespaces as well as kind of do a very like high level filtering of those namespaces as well. You can switch between them super easily. We also made it a lot easier to find and configure the codec server for data converter. We do recommend, of the two ways you can configure data converter, one which was that kind of WebSocket based, you run it from the command line, locally, and the other one of having a remote endpoint that you use to decode your payloads. We definitely recommend that previous one. If you are developing locally, I think that using ngrok works really well for this. That's a conversation that we can have later. But there were just various for one of those setups for what people needed to send to their remote server. You can kind of configure we won't send any more than we absolutely have to, but if there are things that your data encoder remote codec needs, you can choose to kind of opt in to passing along either the cross-origin credentials or various other headers as well, and those will be turned on if you do opt in to it. In addition, as Ryland mentioned, one of the big things was to kind of have a standard abstraction over the various different data stores that you can use in Temporal, which allowed us to kind of have a consistent experience, whether or not you're using anything from SQLite all the way up and through Elasticsearch without having to like turn off features. So some of these features might look totally familiar and not at all new to you. That's because we were able to support them on Elasticsearch. But weirdly, some of these features just weren't available if you were using, a SQL-based data store with a lot of the unified visibility stuff that Ryland talked about earlier. Now we can just support the same experience where you don't have to worry about some of the details of like what data store do you have. And the idea is to give you a kind of consistent development experience regardless of the kind of mechanics of what's underneath. So the cool thing about this is, you have this query field, and you probably remember these from either WebV1 or earlier versions of Temporal UI as kind of like drop downs that maybe were taking a lot of space if you didn't need them. Like toggle back and forth between basic and advanced, because what the original version did, and step one is, try not to move the cheese too much on you, but then step two is try to create a better user experience. So you can kind of begin to tweak some of those settings. You'll see that we will kind of auto-populate a query that you can use both on the command line or wherever you need to do it as well. You'll also notice in the URL that we kind of encode that query as a query param, no pun intended, that allows you to then share that view with anyone on your team or bookmark it or save it and things along those lines. And again, like there are other ways that we could and seek to do that, but like that was like a place where we would love and seek your feedback about like what experiences work best. But a quick and easy way to make it easily shareable and easily storable is to store it in the query param. So that's there for you as well. You also notice that if you hover over like long run, the workflow ID or the type, that you can easily click to filter by that workflow ID, by that type, so on and so forth, and that will be added to the query as well. So it's a really great way to kind of build the queries in the UI without necessarily needing to flip back and forth between the excellent work that Doc's team has done, but kind of like use the UI to teach yourself how to kind of use the query language as well. And I will say this again because it bears repeating, desperately would love any and all feedback on what would be useful to you. Some of those might not be totally possible out of the box, but at least, and then on a longer term plan, we can like begin to like work across various teams to get that in place. Also, you can copy. Yes.
Steve, quick question for you. Where is the best place to give that feedback?
I think like a lot of times, like I think for feature requests, like the GitHub repo is super. We might transfer it to like, our UX team's internal board, right? And a lot of us we might not be able to immediately add, but I would say either opening up a GitHub issue, is particularly if you think it's bug. But then also I think like we are all in the web UI channel in Slack, which is also a really great way because then we can have a dialogue and a conversation, I think at a clip that is a little bit more rewarding than the longer term version of like a GitHub issue kind of discussion, and like for a lot of cases, myself, Alex, who kind of is the tech lead on this part of the project, and Candace would love to even sit down and spend some time with y'all as well. So whichever of those formats feels best for you, we would love to collect it as well. As like I said before, you can also copy. One of the things that we've actually had is kind of like a secret menu feature in the UI, mostly at the request of the SDK team, was you have the ability to download and export an event history for a workflow, which is very useful for using replay with the SDKs. But it's also would be great if you could also like visualize that as well. So we kind of for a while had a secret feature that our own teams were using to kind of like import an event history and be able to view it, as you can see. So you can pick any kind of JSON file that either has the events in a JSON object with an events key, or also just an array of those events. And you can import it, as you can see up there, and then view that workflow. And as we kind of make updates and additions to import event history, or to our event history view, which is, I think, a big focus for us over the next few months, obviously that will be present here as well. And so this is kind of the main thing that I kind of want to show was the ability to do those client actions as well as the bulk actions, but there are also some additional features. And like I said, we seek to iterate a lot of these things on a clip a little bit faster than the typical release cycle, because, there's, you can do that with UIs. So definitely stay tuned for more. And there are probably other little quality of life things we're constantly trying to prove as well.
Cool. I think that's it. Well, I appreciate everyone coming. Hopefully everyone was able to stay and get their question answered, and look forward to seeing you next time. Of course.